French painter Jean-François Millet's humble lifestyle stands in stark contrast to the impact his work had on many artists who succeeded him. Millet focused on harsh rural life, which he represented monumentally and with great respect. His deep understanding of peasant existence and his radical painting and drawing techniques earned him praise in his own time, and also attracted considerable controversy. Less well known is the immense impact Millet had on many generations of future artists. His work inspired Vincent van Gogh, Georges Seurat, Paul Cézanne, Edgar Degas, Pissarro, Monet, Salvador Dali and many more. Millet was born on the 4th of October 1814, in the hamlet of Grouchy, in the parish and commune of Greville near the Normandy coast. He grew up in a close-knit farming family, and was the first child of Jean-Louis Millet and Amy Henry. His father, a prosperous landowner, had inherited a house and 50 acres of land. His mother was deeply religious, and Jean-François became very familiar with the Bible. Under the guidance of 2 village priests, Millet acquired a knowledge of Latin, and developed his lifelong interest in literature. Most importantly, he showed a talent for drawing and painting at a very early age. As the eldest son in the family, he had to help his father with work on the farm. He knew how to mow, to make hay, bind the sheaves, plough and sow. All these motifs would return in his later art. In 1833, when Millet turned 18, his father, recognizing his artistic talent, released him from his farm work and sent him to nearby Cherbourg to study with a local portrait painter, Paul Dumichel. In 1835 Millet's father died, forcing Millet to return home to run the family farm. His grandmother continued to encourage him and pushed him back to his studies, this time with local painter, Théophile Langlois. The new tutor instructed young Millet in much the same way his father and Dumichel had done, by simply encouraging the boy to paint without instruction. After less than a year, Langlois, who was impressed with Millet's talent, asked the Cherbourg Town Council to provide the promising young artist with a scholarship to study art in Paris. In January of 1837, with a Cherbourg stipend of 600 francs, Millet bid farewell to his mother and grandmother and rode by carriage to find lodgings, and to study at the Paris School of Fine Arts. Millet found Paris quite overwhelming. He was laughed at for his unsophisticated country manner, and was swindled out of most of his money. Still seeing himself as the unsophisticated peasant farmer, Millet did not socialize with most of his fellow students at the school. His tutor was the noted history painter Paul Delaroche, who specialized in large historical tableaus, often of a tragic nature, and characterized by close attention to fine detail. Delaroche and the other students did not understand Millet, or his work, and, perhaps even came to fear him. Yet, they all seemed to recognize his talent, despite it being contrary to what was being favored at the time. In 1839, Millet applied for the Rome Prize, but his tutor refused to support his candidacy, as he had already chosen another student to represent the school. Millet left the artist's studio in defiance, and lost his school funding. Feeling despondent, he decided to leave Paris, and to return to Cherbourg to begin his career as a portrait painter. For several years he tried to support himself in Cherbourg, but few of the pictures he submitted to exhibitions were purchased. To earn a living, he painted advertising signs, and portraits of local citizens. The Paris Salon was the official art exhibition of the Academy of Fine Arts, in Paris. The Salon was arguably the greatest annual art event in the Western world. At that time, an artist could only reach the general public through the Paris Salon. One-man and group exhibitions were unheard of, and even art dealers were virtually non-existent. Millet's first successful entry to the Salon was in 1840, with his painting portrait of Madame Lefranc. During this period, His works were heavily influenced by the stark contrasts of light and shadow he found in the paintings in the Spanish Gallery at the Louvre. This self-portrait, where Millet depicts himself as a young bohemian, with long hair framing his finely chiseled features, illustrates the style. He used the same style again in the portrait he completed of the woman who would soon become his wife, Pauline Ono, a Cherbourg dressmaker. In 1841, the pair married, but he did not get on with her family, and the marriage was not a happy one. In 1842 they moved to Paris, where he hoped to become a successful portraitist. After another rejection at the Salon in 1843, and his wife Pauline's tragic early death in 1844 of tuberculosis, Millet returned alone to Cherbourg for the next 18 months. Oddly enough, it was during this difficult time that Millet finally began to truly find his own style. He was still in mourning, and often had trouble paying his debts, and yet his work developed a warmth and charm. His figures were no longer black, with thick shadows, and he stopped following the classic traditions he had learned at the Delaroche studio. In 1845, Millet met the love of his life, Catherine Lemaire, a peasant girl, 12 years his junior, who worked as a domestic servant. They began a relationship, and their first child, a daughter, was born the following year. His unmarried association with Lemaire strained his relationship with his conservative religious family, forcing the couple to leave town. They later married in a civil ceremony in 1853. They would remain together for the rest of Millet's life, and have 9 children together. On their way to Paris, the couple stopped at Le Havre. Millet painted a number of portraits in the town and became quite popular. A public exhibition of his work was held there. But, once he had accumulated 900 francs, the couple left for Paris. From then on, Millet moved away from portrait painting as a career. In Paris, money continued to be elusive, a son was born, and the Salon once again rejected Millet's submissions. To help him out, his artist friends often urged their dealers to buy Millet's paintings, which led to a handful of sales. To make ends meet, Millet began painting compositions in the Romantic style. He often painted lovely paintings of naked, innocent women and children. He also painted more erotically tinged subjects which often displayed traces of his earlier art education. His paintings began to incorporate mythological and religious imagery, both associated with the French Academy and the dreamlike aspects of Romanticism. In the mid-1840s, he began to create nudes for the Parisian market, which were often surprisingly sensual and erotic, even violent. As an example, the biblical story, Susanna and the Elders, had been a popular subject for artists over many centuries. Traditionally, the elders were shown hiding in the bushes, gazing at the naked Susanna. In Millet's version, however, he painted what looks like a brutal attack on Susanna. This made Millet's work far more confronting and alarming than the usual treatment of the story. During the same period, he produced other more pastoral images showing bathing women in a range of poses, sometimes sitting, sometimes crouching. After the late 1840s, Millet gave up painting nudes, although he did return to the subject in the early 1860s when he painted Goose Girl. The painting shows an adolescent peasant girl dipping her feet into a stream. Here he emphasized the rough hands and feet of the girl, as evidence of her labor. This painting, selected for the Paris Salon of 1847, is one of Millet's rare mythological subjects. It is inspired by the ancient Greek legend, in which shepherds rescue the infant Oedipus, who had been strung up in a tree and left to die, because his father believes the prediction that his son will kill him. The painting was well received by the critics, although one remains skeptical of what he perceived as Millet's overly free brushwork. Millet took no active part in the so-called February Revolution of 1848, which was a brief period of civil unrest in France that led to the collapse of the monarchy and the foundation of the French Second Republic. He was, however, greatly troubled by the slaughter and bloodshed, but he felt no sympathy for the cause. For French artists, the establishment of the Second Republic meant that the Paris Salon juries were more democratic, and a much wider range of paintings were accepted. Millet submitted 2 works to the Salon of 1848. One painting, The Captivity of the Jews in Babylon, was disliked, but his work, Winnower, one of his earliest scenes of farm labor, met with a favorable critical reaction, and was purchased by the government for 500 francs. He also received a commission for 1,200 francs from the new Minister of the Interior for the painting, Hagar and Ishmael, one of the largest canvases that he ever undertook. Millet wanted to leave Paris, and had run out of time to finish the picture to his satisfaction. Needing the money, he wrote to the minister telling him the painting was finished, and was paid his 1,200 francs. He took the picture with him when he left Paris, and it remained in his house until he died. In June 1848, the continuing political unrest of the bloody but unsuccessful June Days uprising in Paris, as well as a cholera outbreak, caused Millet to take his wife and children out of Paris to Barbizon, an artists' colony 60 kilometers south of the capital. Millet planned to stay a few weeks, but ended up spending the rest of his life there, and it was in Barbizon that he produced the bulk of his work. Here he found a place that reminded him of his native village, and a group of painters who, like himself, were struggling to make their mark. The Barbizon artists painted landscape in realistic terms, and for its own sake. They based their art on the works of 17th-century French and Dutch painters, as well as contemporary English landscape painters, all of whom approached their subject with sensitive observation and a deep love of nature. The community of Barbizon lay amid flat, fertile and agriculturally rich land, with a diversity of crops, on the edge of the Fontainebleau forest. It had a population of about 200 people at that time. As a farmer himself, Millet was very aware of the impact the introduction of machinery was having on the farmers of France. He was also very familiar with the precarious conditions under which many farm workers lived. He himself worked in his garden and painted to support himself, bringing up his family under the poorest of circumstances. His painting, The Sower, based on his own experiences in the fields, was exhibited at the Realist Salon of 1850-51. It challenged the Parisian middle classes to reflect on the conditions in which their food was being produced. Needless to say, The Sower did not find a welcoming audience. Millet never discussed his political views, but his art seems to express a clearly republican and socially critical stance. Although criticized for elevating lowly peasants, at a time when the rural poor were degraded and seen as a threat to the middle classes, The Sower represented Millet's own profound personal beliefs on the role of farm workers in society. He spent his whole life amid the labors of peasants. He had all their passions and all their prejudices, including their hatred of Paris and of the Parisian spirit, and the ardent love of the land. In 1851, he wrote to his friend, and later biographer, Alfred Sensier, saying that such works suit my temperament best, for I must confess, even if you think me a socialist, the human side of art is what touches me the most. Millet's sensibilities are clearly illustrated in his painting, Harvesters Resting. Millet had originally intended to depict the Bible story of Ruth, a poor widow and farm worker, who met Boaz, the landowner and kinsman, who eventually became her husband. When he showed the work at the 1853 Salon, Millet changed the title to Harvesters Resting. In this painting, Ruth's meager bundle looks insignificant compared to the stacks of grain behind her, and Boaz is not the landowner of the biblical story, but a sharecropper, hired to work a rich man's land. In this, as in so many of his works, Millet urged respect for the hardship and dignity of humble lives. The painting won a medal at the Salon, the only time his work won an award. The human side of life touched Millet most deeply, and in many of his earlier pictures, landscape was secondary. Gradually, he grew into the larger conception of a perfect harmony between man and his environment. Henceforth, landscape ceased to be a mere setting, or background in a picture, and became an organic part of the composition. Landscape and figure now fitted together in perfect unity. An example is this painting, where the classical composition and the display of golden light ensured its selection at the 1857 Paris Salon, but like the sower, it also made the French public uncomfortable. In Millet's day, French farmers followed a centuries-old practice to leave gleanings, or leftover scraps of the grain harvest, in the fields so that poor women and children could live on them. The grinding poverty of the peasant women, evident in their rough, simple garments, and the back-breaking work of collecting individual grains, appear as a modern depiction of the ancient practice. Conservatives saw a threatening message in Millet's sympathetic representation of these impoverished outsiders. One critic called the three gleaners the three ugly fates of pauperism. Others, however, who were more supportive, saw that Millet gave a nobility to his subjects. In 1857, Millet painted this unusual example of Christian art, expressing a profound sense of religious devotion. It became one of the most widely reproduced religious paintings of the 19th century, with thousands of prints displayed by devout householders across France. Despite their humble circumstances, this simple act of devotion and the sculptural quality of their figures lends the farmer and his wife a kind of quiet dignity, yet their worn clothes and their bowed shoulders suggest a life of earthly toil. The original painting, which was for a commission, was completed during the summer of 1857 but never collected. Millet added a steeple and changed the initial title of the work, Prayer for the Potato Crop, to the Angelus. It was exhibited at the Salon in 1859. In 1889, the Angelus became the most expensive work of art of the period. Accompanied by avid coverage in the press, it changed hands for the unprecedented sum of 553,000 francs before finally finding its way to the Louvre. The work influenced Vincent van Gogh's Peasants Planting Potatoes of 1885, and served as a catalyst for his return to painting, so great was his admiration. For the artist Salvador Dali, it became a kind of artistic obsession, as he recreated the scene many times. This painting was accepted in the 1859 Paris Salon, but attacked by a critic who argued that Millet treated his peasants with an excessive sense of gravity. His peasants have too high an opinion of themselves, he said. In focusing on peasantry, Millet was representing a rural class that dominated in France in terms of numbers. In the mid-19th century, 75% of France's population lived off the land, a higher proportion than in other European nations. He was also representing a class that was in crisis. The typical peasant worker earned about 1.25 francs per day, compared to the wages of Parisian manual workers, who earned 3 to 5 francs a day. Millet's radical credentials were further reinforced when an image of the tired labors of an aged woodcutter was refused by the 1859 Paris Salon. Woodcutters, as itinerant workers who formed part of an emerging rural working class that threatened to revolt, were also seen as controversial figures by the establishment. Millet did not back down in the face of criticism. Instead, he created a picture that was possibly the most controversial of his career, when it was exhibited at the 1863 Paris Salon. Millet showed an exhausted laborer using his hoe to remove weeds and rocks from poor ground, in order to create cultivable land like that in the distance. The result is a sense of heroic strength and nobility, in the pursuit of hard work. Both the public and critics reacted negatively to the work, seeing the figure as a frightening, brutish giant, and the painting itself as a social protest on behalf of peasants. Having been raised in a deeply religious rural farming family, Millet saw the peasant class as most nobly fulfilling the words of the Old Testament book of Genesis, which reads, "In the sweat of thy brow shalt thou eat bread." Despite being described as a socialist revolutionary, Millet's viewpoint was more religiously fatalistic than political. Millet, who had 6 daughters, was very interested in the theme of women's rural labor. During his career he painted milkmaids, apple gatherers, washerwomen, butter churners, firewood gatherers and shepherdesses. Female rural workers were very poorly paid, earning around half the amount earned by a male worker. They were crucial, however, in the workings of the farm, and particularly in the cycle surrounding the production of wool. Millet represented the different stages, from the tending of the flocks to sheep shearing, carding, spinning and knitting. Particularly notable was one of his largest paintings, a sheep shearer, which he exhibited in the Paris Salon in 1861. Here he represents a life-size female peasant, while her male colleague, who holds down the animal, stands behind her in the shadows. He also produced several images of carding, and women spinning wool into yarn, as in this colorful picture. Millet created several interior scenes around the theme of knitting, culminating in this painting, which he showed at the 1869 Salon. This was the first painting of peasant life he had exhibited at the Salon for 5 years, and it showed that his peasant imagery, even a work so seemingly inoffensive, still had the ability to shock. The picture was widely ridiculed for its unidealized aspects. His supporters, however, praised its naturalism, tanned skin and chapped hands, the result of outdoor work. Throughout his career, Millet had been a prolific draftsman. Black and white pictures had their charm for him, as truly as those in color. Indeed, he once said that tone, which is the most important part of color, can be perfectly expressed in black and white. His drawings and pastels were often seen as more modern than his paintings, especially when they appeared at public exhibitions in the 1880s. These appeared in his School of Fine Arts retrospective in 1887, and also in a special display of drawings at the Exposition Universelle in 1889. He also produced large numbers of presentation drawings for the Parisian market, using Conti crayon, rather than charcoal, and he built up his surfaces with dense crosshatching rather than rubbing. French painters of Millet's day almost all suffered cruelly from want, poverty, hunger, illness and ill luck of every kind. Millet shared the common fate. He suffered like others from poverty, loneliness and indifference. But what makes him exceptional, and distinguishes him from others, is the tranquility with which he accepted his ill fortune. He often came to the end of his supplies, as the baker refused him bread, and the tradesmen called in the bailiffs. In 1853 he was left with exactly 2 francs. In 1856 he wrote, "How shall I get my month's rent? For after all, the first thing is that the children must eat." In 1859, he wrote, "How hard the winter is to bear when your paintings aren't selling, and you are forever on the brink of starvation. We only have wood for 2 or 3 days, and do not know how to get any more. My wife will be confined next month, and I shall be without anything." In addition to all this, he was often ill. Worn out, in spite of his robust peasant constitution, by the hard life that he was compelled to live. Several times he was at death's door. In 1838 when he was in extremis, in 1848, when he lay delirious for a month, and was penniless. Again in 1859, when he was on the point of going blind, and was spitting blood. In 1847 he wrote, "Art is not a diversion. It is a conflict, a complication of wheels in which one is crushed. I am not a philosopher. I do not wish to do away with pain, nor to find a formula that will make me stoical and indifferent. Pain is perhaps the thing that gives artists the strongest power of expression." This painting, Waiting demonstrates Millet's interest in religious subject matter, which reappeared again and again throughout his career. As a painter, he breathed the spirit of the scriptures into all that he saw. His mind was full of them, and he quoted them often. This painting shows a sad scene from the Bible's Book of Tobit. The aged Anna looks into the distance in the hope of seeing the return of her son, Tobias, who had departed several months ago to recover a debt. Waiting had a very personal narrative for Millet. His mother, in poor health, wrote to him in the early 1850s, urging him to return to his birthplace of Grouchy to see her. Preoccupied with his financial affairs and artistic ambitions in Paris and Barbizon, he did not do so, and in April 1853, his mother died. Overcome with remorse, and as a way of dealing with his pain, Millet sketched out this painting as a kind of memorial to his mother, seeing her yearning for his return paralleled in the biblical story. Waiting, exhibited at the 1861 Paris Salon, openly challenged the academic tradition of French religious painting. Millet controversially situated it in a rustic French village, rather than in the Middle East, and used peasants from Barbizon as his models, thus heightening the authenticity of the scene. In the late 1860s, Millet began to add pastel to his black chalk drawings of peasants and rural life, with the hope that the addition of color would make his drawings more marketable. Between 1865 and 1869, he worked almost exclusively in pastel, producing more than 100 works. Crucial to his production was the patronage of the architect and collector, Émile Gavotte, who paid him a monthly retainer to produce a regular output of works in pastel, leaving Millet to choose his own subjects. Millet also revisited earlier works, changing the locale from Normandy to Barbizon. A rich range of pastel tones were used, both over and under drawings in black crayon. By the mid-1860s, the landscape itself was becoming the dominant player in his painting compositions. Millet's works are notable for their high horizon lines, and with the foreground often left completely empty. In this painting, exhibited at the 1867 Salon, he depicted an abandoned plough and harrow on the plain of Shiley. His focus is on the earth in the foreground, and on the slight curve of the horizon. Millet felt that every glimpse of the horizon, however narrow, should be felt to be a segment of the great circle that bounds our vision. Compositionally, Millet's landscapes are among his most formally radical work. It is here that Millet's pictures diverge from Western tradition. His cropping effects, and emphasized foregrounds, remind us of Eastern practices, such as Japanese woodblock prints. Millet's landscapes have a depth of spaciousness which reaches into infinite distance. The principles of composition are applied in perspective as well as laterally. We can look into the picture, through it, and beyond it, as if we were standing in the presence of nature. Regarding composition, Millet's pictures have great excellence. "I try not to have things look as if chance brought them together," he said, "but as if they had a necessary bond between them. Nothing is accidental, but every object, however small, is an indispensable part of the whole scheme." In this picture, rather than emphasizing the picturesque goat girl who spins a length of wool, at the top of the painting, he focused on rendering a steep rock face of earth, wheat and thistles, rising to a high horizon. One critic wrote of Millet, "No painter, in any school, has pushed further the study and art of the foreground." Millet's fascination with open plains culminated in this work in which the earth rises up towards a distant horizon where a man shoots at a flock of crows. We now have only a black and white photograph of the picture because in May 1945, a fire in the Friedrichshain Flak Tower destroyed the majority of the Berlin Museum holdings stored there, including this picture. When it was shown at the 1870 Salon, a young avant-garde critic praised the work, stating that there was nothing greater in the whole modern school. Another was equally effusive, "It is the most beautiful landscape that has been painted. For 20 years, I have known nothing that surpasses it." Millet's focus on the earth is also evident in this picture, where he again emphasized the complexity of the land. In 1887, at Millet's retrospective, a critic wrote that for most landscapists, the earth is superficial, for Millet it is profound. As a painter of landscapes, Millet mastered a wide range of the effects of changing light during different hours of the day. The glare of noonday in the gleaners, the sunset glow in the Angelus and the shepherdess, the somber twilight of the sower, and the glimmering lamplight of the woman sewing, each found perfect interpretation in his work. Though showing himself capable of representing powerfully the more violent aspects of nature, he preferred, as a rule, the normal and quiet. In 1867, the Exposition Universelle hosted a major retrospective of his work, with the Gleaners, the Angelus and this painting, the Potato Planters, among those exhibited. The following year, Frederick Hartmann commissioned a series based on the 4 seasons of the year, for 25,000 francs, and in 1868, Millet was named Knight of the Legion of Honor, the highest order of merit, both civil and military, in France. Towards the end of his life, Millet's method of working continued to develop, as is evident in his late seascapes. In this painting he depicts a rocky outcrop, reducing the composition to the 3 principal areas, earth, sea and sky. A critic described it as a triple portrait of these 3 elements, adding that the more Millet simplifies, the more he achieves. Depicting the rugged beauty of the Normandy coast, this work shows the view of the ocean from the Greville cliffs, their greenish-brown slopes, and the ocean breaking along the rocky shore, lit by the sunlight of a hazy, golden sky. Millet's painterly style at this point includes loose gestural brushwork, with a lightened palette, very much in keeping with the Impressionist manner of Monet and Van Gogh's works. But, unlike the Impressionists, he never painted outdoors. Millet used graphite and ink to accentuate certain aspects of his landscape, the rocky shoreline, various planes of shadow on the boulders and the cliff face, and, high up at the horizon. This was Millet's largest picture of the coastline and was described by the painter Charles Tillot as the crowning glory of Millet's landscapes. Throughout the 1860s and early 1870s, Millet's reputation and success grew, and his paintings were selling for considerable amounts, largely as a result of the patronage of his art dealers. Woman Sewing by Lamplight was sold to the Frick collection for 14,000 francs. And this one, for 10,000 francs. Millet worked on his 4 seasons commissioned paintings, intermittently for the last 7 years of his life. In this work, depicting autumn, the harvest is finished, the gleaners have departed, and the sheep are left to graze. Beyond the haystacks lie the plain of Shiley, and the rooftops of Barbizon. The loose, sketch-like finish of this work is characteristic of Millet's late style. Patches of the dark lilac-pink ground color are deliberately exposed, and the underdrawing is visible, particularly in the outlines of the haystacks and the sheep. In 1870, Millet was elected to the Salon jury. Later that year, he and his family fled the Franco-Prussian War, moving to Cherbourg and then to Greville, and did not return to Barbizon until late in 1871. The expressiveness of Millet's brushwork in this painting, Birds' Nesters, communicates the frenzied movements of the hunters and the explosive panic of the birds so effectively that the viewer is able to experience the intensity themselves. He based the scene on stories from his childhood that told of great flights of wild pigeons. When the birds settled in trees at night, the peasants blinded them with light from torches and then clubbed hundreds to death. What puts Birds' Nesters within the realm of realism, however, was the grim reality of the hunt, and its necessity. It was so that poor peasants could feed themselves, and their families, on the birds they could gather. Millet's last years were marked by financial success and increased official recognition. For the first time in his life, He had more requests for paintings than he could fulfill, and his pictures were getting increasingly higher prices. The critics may still have questioned his choice of subjects, but there was little they could dispute in his talent. In 1874, after a period of declining health due to headaches and sciatica, Millet began to fear his approaching death. He married Catherine Lemaire in a religious ceremony, so that she could inherit, and to ensure that his family could hold a church funeral for him when he died. 3 weeks later, on January 20, 1875 at home in Barbizon, he died, and was buried at the nearby cemetery in Shiley. Millet's death heightened interest in his work, as did a number of exhibitions and sales. A remarkable amount of his work was on view in Paris. His posthumous sales included major works, such as The Pig Killers, which sold for 24,000 francs. And the state bought Church at Greville, and the picture, Two Bathers, seen earlier. The prices that Millet's paintings achieved at these and other late 19th century sales demonstrate that the artist's death, coupled with a new appreciation for his treatment of peasant life, boosted the value of his body of work substantially. In 1881, Millet's friend, Alfred Sensier, published a biography of the artist. The book swiftly became a must-read and established the myth of the misunderstood artist whose desire, as a peasant among peasants, was to depict humanity's destiny to be forever in the fields. As a result, a conservative art world accepted the artist's images more readily. The biography boosted Millet's popularity, and was followed by a monographic exhibition in 1887 at the School of Fine Arts in Paris. Millet developed into a mythical figure in France, and an example for academic artists and the avant-garde alike. His work also influenced a wide variety of local and international artists. Many young painters spoke about their relationship to Millet's work. Their own art shows that they undeniably drew on the example of Millet, appropriating his work and modernizing it in a new impressionist language. Between the late 19th century and 1914, peasant life was one of the most favored themes for painters. Certain motifs, like the sower, the mower, and the gleaners, can be found again and again in the works of artists that followed Millet. Particularly, they were influenced by Millet's preference for radically unidealized subjects, such as everyday peasantry and bare expanses of land. His innovative compositions, especially his use of a high horizon line, and his rough painting surfaces, challenged traditional conventions of the academic polished finish. In 1884, Vincent van Gogh wrote to his brother Theo, "To me, Millet, not Manet, is that essential modern painter who opened the horizon to many." His words referred to the perception, even in the 1880s, that modern art originated with the works of the painter Edouard Manet. Be that as it may, Van Gogh suggested an alternative, a rural counterpoint to Manet's urban modernism. Other artists made use of Millet's subjects, modifying them slightly, but keeping the basic design. Edgar Degas copied Millet's pastel technique, including dense crosshatching, accumulated layers of color, and the fusion of colored pastel and black Conti crayon. Even Pablo Picasso modified Millet's peasants to suit his own style. Degas tried to introduce Léon Augustin Lemaitre to the Impressionist group, because he also used Millet's images. Pissarro focused on the subject of peasantry more than any of the other Impressionists. Monet admired Millet's work. When he saw Millet at a party, he was in such awe of the artist that he missed the opportunity to talk to him. He also used Millet's imagery, but with brighter colors. Jean-François Millet produced art of simple grandeur, depicting a solemn, epic struggle, the conflict of man with the earth from which he has sprung. Part of a great and changeless order, he showed us the close ties that link human joys and sorrow with the changes of the seasons, and the beauty of the natural world. His use of naturalism and unromanticized imagery has helped to lay the foundation for later modern movements in art.